Hi, everybody. I want to thank the women's group of New Seabury for having me here today and for the delicious lunch. And I appreciate everyone coming out to enjoy a meal together and to learn a little bit about my books. As Julie mentioned, I'm Kathryn Perrone. I write under the pen name Kathryn Knight, and I write in the romance genre. So the romance genre actually has dozens of subgenres within it. Examples such as historical romance, inspirational. A little louder?
Yeah, right here.
Right here. I've never been told I'm too quiet. Historical romance would be an example, contemporary, inspirational romance. So my books would fall under what's called paranormal romantic suspense, the majority of my books. So it's romantic suspense mixed with a paranormal element, and for me that is usually ghost mysteries. So I also do have one traditional romantic suspense out, Dangerous Currents, and I have a young adult or YA book out called Divine Fall, and that's appropriate for teenagers. My first book, Silver Lake, was published in 2012, and it's been a really exciting 8 years since then. As Julie mentioned, I've won some awards. My books have hit the #1 ranking on both Amazon and Barnes & Noble a few times, the USA Today bestseller list, and as she mentioned, The Haunting of Hillwood Farm has been optioned for a movie. 4 of my books have been made into audiobooks, which is a really exciting process. It's a huge growing market, and it's really thrilling to hear a narrator bring your story to life. Another one of the highlights of my writing journey was signing books with Mary Higgins Clark. She's known as the Queen of Suspense. Sadly, she passed away last winter, but I grew up reading her books and loving her books. So that sort of ties into my writing journey. Not a creative writing major. I studied business in school, but I've always been an avid reader. For as long as I could read, I've been reading, and it's still my favorite hobby to the day. When I was younger, my father would go to the library once a week, and he would enlist the help of the librarian to pick out books appropriate for my age. And he'd come home with a stack, and I would read through them, and then I'd reread the ones that were my favorites until the next group came home. Usually, because I love animals, and especially horses, that was the topics of the books, but one time a book called Jane Emily came, and it was a very sweet romance mixed with a pretty spooky ghost mystery for a children's book. And I was hooked. So I sort of credit that with being my initial introduction into paranormal romantic suspense. And I even read the books to my kids or read that book as one of the books that I used to read to my kids out loud. Interestingly enough, it's set in Lynn, Massachusetts, which didn't mean a lot to me growing up in the Washington, D.C. area, but I found it to be a pretty interesting coincidence when I did realize it as I read it to my children. Around that time when my kids were in grade school is when I started coming up with the idea for my first novel, Silver Lake. And I've always been, if I wasn't reading, then usually I was making up stories in my head, but this one really stuck. And I started to develop plot twists and characters and dialogue, and eventually I had an entire story arc in my mind. And I told my husband about it, and he encouraged me to write it down, which is not as easy as you might think, but I did. I started writing it in a notebook on a car ride. And that book took 2.5 years to write. I did switch to a laptop. I didn't do it all in the notebook. The final product was quite a bit different, but in 2.5 years I had a full-length novel, and I started what is called the querying process. So basically you pitch your book via a query letter to agents and editors to see if they would purchase the rights and give you a publishing contract. And I had some interest, but nothing really panned out. So I went back and I did a lot of revisions, editing, rewriting. I made it a much shorter book, cut down the word count. I improved my query letter to make it a little bit more appealing to agents and editors who literally get hundreds a day. And a small publisher was interested, and they requested the first 3 chapters. After that, they requested the full manuscript, and they came back with a what's known as an R&R, or a revise and resubmit. So while I was hoping for the publishing contract, it's not a bad thing. They give you the feedback that they think needs to happen to make it a book that is going to sell. And if you're willing to do the work and make those changes, then they will take a look at it again and you can resubmit. Certainly not a guarantee, but I did the work, and I received the publishing contract in December of 2011. So I still remember dancing around my kitchen with my younger son who hadn't gotten on the bus yet that day. So it was a very, very memorable day. That book has actually gone on to hit the #1 ranking on Amazon, and it was acquired by a larger publisher as well. So as Silver Lake was going through the process of being published, it takes a long time, often a year or more. I started writing my next novel, and I found I could write much faster, having learned the way to structure a book and where to start it and all the mechanics. And that holds true for all my books. I can write them more quickly, but you have to have the inspiration. So that can be the tough part. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about inspiration. I get it from many places. I do write ghost stories, so I tend to visit a lot of haunted places. I've even been known to sneak into abandoned buildings and condemned buildings. But one of my more interesting stories about inspiration involves my novel Haunted Souls, which was my 4th book. One summer when my sister was here visiting, she likes spooky stuff like I do, and we went to a ghost tour in Barnstable Village. And there is the oldest wooden jail in the country there, which is right on 6A next to the Coast Guard Museum. And it's a historic gem. It's amazing. And the tour started there and finished there. There have been many, many deaths in that structure because of the poor conditions and the malnutrition and disease that went through all throughout the time it was in use. So it's reportedly actively haunted. And one of the volunteers told a story about bringing a spirit home to her house, having something follow her home, and she described some of these poltergeist-like activities, and a light went on in my head, and that was the inspiration for Haunted Souls. I won't give out any spoilers, but it does take place in Barnstable Village, and the old jail does play a part. Other places that I have found inspiration are plot holes in movies, newspaper articles, history of Cape Cod, a walk in the woods where I imagined what would happen if I found a dead body, and I didn't, thankfully, but that book became Dangerous Currents. So I can find inspiration in a lot of different places, but I can't really force it. I just have to wait for it to happen. Once I do have that initial inspiration, I like to outline where my story is going to go. I'm what's known as a plotter, not a pantster. Pantsters write by the seat of their pants. And so some people, some authors can just sit down and open up the computer and start typing and see what happens. I can't really start unless I know that I have a viable story that's going to work and be a complete story arc with a satisfying resolution. And I don't have to know everything, but I do need to know that I'm going to have the elements that are required. And the way I outline is a method called goal, motivation, and conflict. So it's also known as GMC, the initials. And I learned it from a book called Goal, Motivation, and Conflict. It's in the CLAM system. And it's a really great book on writing. Basically, you identify your character's goals, motivations, and conflicts. So the goal would be what your character is trying to achieve, what they want. The motivation would be why they want it. And the conflict is what is keeping them from getting that, the struggle, the obstacle. Because a character that easily gets anything they want makes for a very boring story. So conflict is key, and it has to be a part of it. So the book breaks it down to just a single sentence. Character wants goal because motivation, but conflict. And then you try to take your character and fill in the blanks. So if I was going to use an example from my book, Gull Harbor, it's about a psychic medium who comes to Gull Harbor, which is a made-up village, but it's based on Wellfleet. And she is hired to rid a haunted house of its ghost, a destructive ghost. So her sentence would just be, Claire wants to rid the house of a ghost because it's her job, but the spirit won't communicate with her. So there's your conflict. And you can have internal and external GMCs. It being her job as a psychic medium, that's external. But I also like to think about what some internal motivations might be. For this character, it would be trying to prove to her father that she made the right choice rather than going to law school like he demanded. It was succeeding in one of the first big challenges of her career. It was helping the poor couple that spent their life savings on this house and then had to leave because it was uninhabitable. So those are some internal motivators as well. And the romance piece allows me to start another initial GMC. So for this book, when Claire arrives in Gull Harbor, she immediately runs into her ex-boyfriend, Max, who promised to love her forever through college, through their relationship, and then disappeared one day with just an I'm sorry note left behind. So she runs into him, and questions arise. So her GMC for that situation would be Claire wants to know why Max left her that way, because he broke her heart, and she still has feelings for him. But he has a secret he's guarding, and he's not revealing it. So I start with those initial GMCs and build from there. And things can change, goals can change, motivations can change, but that's how I start the beginning of my outline, and that gets me going into thinking about the different scenes. I also like to have a GMC for each character. So even if I'm writing a ghost story, the ghost has a GMC, because a ghost that just hangs around and haunts a house for no good reason doesn't make for a very strong story. So I think about what this ghost would want. Does it want revenge, or to see its killer brought to justice, send a message to its family, have its body found, be buried properly? So there's all kinds of things that come into play when I'm thinking about that. And the same thing goes for a villain. If you have a villain in a book that is just doing bad things because he just does bad things, that doesn't make for a very compelling story either. So you have to think about what the villain's motivations would be, whether it's greed, power, money, love, even voices in the head or compulsion, things like that, that drive that character's actions. And that all works together to create the building blocks. So then once I have that framework, that GMC framework, I also have to think about the requirements of romance, because every genre has certain parameters that you have to stick to, especially when you are going to be submitting to be traditionally published. For example, in the mystery genre, readers expect at the end of the story that a case will be solved. If you had a mystery that ended with the detectives throwing in the towel and saying, well, we couldn't figure it out this time, we'll put it into cold case and maybe next time, you would have a lot of frustrated readers, and it definitely wouldn't get picked up for publication. So there are two main requirements when you're writing a romance for a book to truly be called a romance. And the first one is that the relationship between the two characters has to be central to the plot. So that love story needs to be a focal point. And the second one is there must be an HEA, which is a happily ever after. So you have to have the couple end up together at the end, either happily ever after or at least happy for now in case you're going to write a sequel and break them up again and bring them back together. So an HEA is required, and what that means is that I cannot kill my two main characters. That actually makes my job quite a bit harder as someone who writes suspense. I have to create enough tension to keep the readers worried about my characters when on some level they know that they're going to be okay in the end. So romance as a genre is actually the largest genre. A lot of people don't know that. It's the biggest in terms of sales, and it consistently has the largest share of the fiction market, more so than mystery, science fiction, and fantasy combined. Romance readers are very loyal. They read a lot, and that's both good and bad for romance authors. It's great that there are so many readers out there. However, the competition is fierce because there's so many romance authors out there too, and some of them write very prolifically, several books a year. So I'm lucky that my books also appeal to people who read other genres like mystery, suspense, thrillers, even horror. I do have paperback books over there, and as I mentioned, they are all, well, some of them are on Audible as audiobooks, some are on iBooks, Nook. They're all available on Kindle. October is the perfect month to dive into a spooky story, so I'd love to sign books for anyone who's interested after. But I just want to first thank everybody again for coming out and see if there's any questions that you have for me. Yes? It really depends on whether I'm actively working on a book. I tend to take breaks between until I get inspiration or just because I need a break. But when I'm right in the middle of it, I usually will spend several hours a day, but I don't set times like some authors will say, my writing time is 8 to 10 in the morning or something like that. I'm more think about it as I go along the day and then sit down and get it down on the computer when I have time. Yes? Well, I would love for it to be in theaters, but it's an option, and an option is just that. Somebody purchased the rights or purchased the option to make it into a movie. The majority of options don't go anywhere, unfortunately. they have reserved the opportunity to make a movie if they could get the funding together, get the production behind it, find the actors and actresses, and pull all that together along with the screenplay. So an option lasts for a certain period of time to see if they are able to do that, and then it expires. So I like to keep my fingers crossed, but I'm also realistic, and I know a lot of options just don't make it with all the constraints. Yvonne? Oh, thank you. Yvonne was saying that I teach classes too. I teach a lot of fitness classes, and currently at USA Fitness in Falmouth. And Yvonne is one of my members, and we have a lot of fun there. And it feels really good to be back after all the time spent indoors on Zoom. That's Kathryn Perrone, not Kathryn Knight. Same person, though.
What advice would you give someone
Sure. I used to teach writing fiction classes before the pandemic hit. I taught classes live for Cape Cod Community College and the Falmouth Leisure. And the most important thing is persistence, not giving up. Again, some people are pantsters, some people are plotters, some people are somewhere in the middle. But if you're just starting out, it's helpful to try to at least have an idea of where your story's going. And reading books that are similar to the genre that you want to write in and really thinking about what makes that book work is really helpful. Yes? Oh boy. No, I have visited Gettysburg, and I have heard it is one of the most haunted places. So I didn't see anything myself or hear anything myself. I'm still sort of waiting for that, although if and when it does happen, I'll probably be scared as much as I like the idea. But yes, that is well known for its paranormal activity. Oh no, I'm definitely not a medium. A few of my characters in my books are mediums, so I've done a lot of research on that. But I definitely have had experiences with two separate mediums that convinced me that there are some people who have the gift to be able to connect. I went in a little bit skeptical, even believing in ghosts, not sure whether I believe that people could communicate with them, but now I do. Julie?
you have antagonistic ghosts?
I do. I usually do, yes.
So, how did you get the idea?
Well, a lot of times the ghosts are angry. They want something, like when I was talking about motivation, and they're frustrated, they don't know how to get it. So it certainly shouldn't be easy. If a ghost could easily communicate, then there would be no unsolved murders, anywhere, because ghosts would just spell out who the perpetrator was, and that would be that. So usually, yes, they are antagonistic. Some of them come around and are a little friendlier, and some don't. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate everyone coming out today, and thank you for inviting me.